Sarah Martinez had always hated thrift stores. The musty smell of old clothes, the desperate energy of people hunting for bargains, the way everything seemed to carry the weight of someone else's discarded life. But here she was, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in downtown Phoenix, killing time before her therapy appointment, wandering through racks of forgotten dreams and abandoned possessions. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Maybe that was the problem with her life these days. She never seemed to be looking for anything in particular, just drifting like she had been for the past 8 years since coming home from Iraq. The therapist, Dr. Chen, kept telling her she needed to find purpose again, something to anchor her to the present, instead of letting her mind drift back to that dusty road outside Fallujah, where everything changed. The rain drummed against the store's windows with a steady rhythm that reminded Sarah of distant gunfire, though she tried to push that thought away. She'd gotten better at controlling the flashbacks over the years, but certain sounds, certain smells, certain combinations of light and shadow could still transport her back to that desert hellscape, where she'd left pieces of her soul scattered in the sand. Sarah moved past a rack of polyester dresses that probably hadn't been fashionable since the 80s, her fingers absently trailing along the fabric. The store was nearly empty, except for an elderly man examining a chess set and a young mother trying to convince her toddler that they didn't need another stuffed animal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that reminded her too much of the forward operating base where she'd spent 18 months of her life. She paused at a display of old books, running her fingers along the spines. The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien caught her eye, and she pulled it from the shelf. She'd read it in college before she'd enlisted, before she'd understood what it really meant to carry things, not just the physical weight of gear and weapons, but the invisible burden of memories, guilt, and the faces of people who didn't make it home. The book fell open to a passage she remembered. They carried the soldier's greatest fear, which was the fear of blushing. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. Sarah closed the book quickly, the words hitting too close to home. She'd enlisted partly for noble reasons, to serve her country, to make a difference, but also because she'd been afraid of being seen as a coward, afraid of disappointing her father who'd served in Vietnam, afraid of not measuring up to some impossible standard of heroism. She was about to leave when something caught her eye. There in a glass case near the register, sitting between a collection of costume jewelry and a tarnished silver picture frame, was a Bronze Star medal. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She moved closer, her heart beginning to race in that familiar way that meant her body was preparing for fight or flight, even though there was no enemy here, no IED buried in the road, no sniper's bullet whistling through the air. But this wasn't just any Bronze Star. As Sarah leaned closer to the glass, her hands began to shake. She knew that medal. She knew the small dent in the Bronze Star itself, the way the ribbon had faded slightly on one edge, the tiny scratch across the eagle's wing. She knew it because it was hers. The medal she had lost during the worst night of her life, when the PTSD had hit her like a freight train and she'd destroyed half her apartment in a rage-fueled blackout. When she'd come to the next morning, surrounded by broken glass and overturned furniture, the medal was gone. She'd assumed she'd thrown it away in her fury, another casualty of the war that kept fighting itself inside her head long after she'd come home. That night had been the culmination of months of deteriorating mental health. Sarah had been struggling to readjust to civilian life, bouncing between jobs, unable to maintain relationships, drinking too much and sleeping too little. The nightmares came every night without fail. Miguel's face, the sound of the explosion, the weight of those 3 civilians she'd pulled to safety while her squad leader died covering her retreat. She'd tried to explain it to her family, to her friends, but how do you describe the feeling of being haunted by your own survival? How do you tell people that every breath you take feels stolen from someone more deserving? Her sister had tried to be supportive, but Sarah could see the frustration in her eyes, the way she'd started to avoid Sarah's calls. Her parents had suggested she move on and focus on the positive, as if trauma was something you could simply choose to leave behind. The breaking point had come on a Tuesday night in November. Sarah had been watching the news, seeing reports of another bombing in Iraq, more soldiers killed, more families destroyed. Something inside her had snapped. She'd started throwing things, books, dishes, furniture, screaming at the television, at God, at Miguel for dying, and leaving her to carry the weight of his sacrifice. When she'd woken up the next morning, her apartment looked like a war zone. Blood on her knuckles from punching the wall, glass embedded in her feet from the broken picture frames, and the medal was gone. She'd searched everywhere, convinced she'd thrown it away in her rage, and the loss had felt like losing Miguel all over again. "Excuse me," Sarah called to the teenage clerk behind the counter, her voice barely steady. "That bronze star in the case, where did it come from?" The kid looked up from his phone, annoyed at being interrupted. He had the kind of bored expression that suggested he'd never considered that the objects in this store might have stories, might have meant everything to someone once upon a time. "I don't know, lady. People bring stuff in all the time. You want to buy it or what? How much?" "Tag says $50. $50. Sarah almost laughed, but it came out as more of a choke. $50 for a medal that had cost her everything, her peace of mind, her sense of self-worth, her ability to sleep through the night without seeing the faces of the dead. $50 for a piece of bronze and ribbon that represented the worst and best day of her military career. $50 for something that had been bought with blood and sacrifice and the life of the best man she'd ever known. She thought about Miguel's wife, Maria, and how she'd looked at that medal ceremony 8 years ago. The way she'd held her daughters close, trying to be strong while they gave Sarah a piece of metal for being alive when her husband wasn't. Sarah had wanted to give the medal to Maria that day, had felt sick accepting recognition for surviving when Miguel had paid the ultimate price. But protocol was protocol, and heroes were supposed to accept their medals with dignity and pride. She bought it without hesitation, her hands trembling as she handed over the cash. The clerk wrapped it carelessly in tissue paper, like it was just another piece of junk instead of a symbol of honor that someone had bled for. Sarah clutched the small package to her chest as she walked out into the rain, her mind reeling. The parking lot was nearly empty, puddles reflecting the grey sky like broken mirrors. Sarah sat in her car, engine off, staring at the medal in her hands. The rain on the windshield distorted the world outside, making everything look like it was underwater, dreamlike and unreal. She unwrapped the tissue paper carefully, as if the medal might crumble to dust if she handled it too roughly. How had her medal ended up in a thrift store? She'd torn her apartment apart looking for it after that night, searched every dumpster in a 6-block radius. She'd been so sure she'd destroyed it in her rage, thrown it away like she'd thrown away everything else good in her life. But here it was, somehow making its way back to her like a ghost from her past. Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at the medal in her hands. The Bronze Star with Valor device awarded for her actions on March 15, 2016, outside Fallujah. The day she'd saved 3 Iraqi civilians from a suicide bomber. The day her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, had died covering her retreat. The memories came flooding back with crystalline clarity. It had been a routine patrol, or as routine as anything could be in a war zone. They'd been checking on a marketplace that had been hit by insurgents the week before, making sure the local vendors felt safe enough to return to business. Miguel had been joking about something, she couldn't remember what now, making the squad laugh despite the tension that always hung in the air like smoke. Then, the first explosion had ripped through the morning calm. Not close enough to hurt them, but close enough to send everyone diving for cover. Sarah had seen the family, a woman and 2 small children, caught in the open, frozen with terror as chaos erupted around them. Without thinking, she'd broken cover, sprinting across the exposed ground toward them. That's when she'd seen the second bomber, a young man with dead eyes and a vest full of explosives, moving toward the crowd of panicking civilians. She'd screamed a warning, but her voice was lost in the noise of gunfire and screaming. Miguel had seen him too, had started moving to intercept, but he was too far away. She could still see his face, could still hear his voice calling out to her as the second explosion ripped through the marketplace. "Martinez, get those people out of here. Go, go, go." She'd grabbed the family, a mother and 2 young children who'd been caught in the crossfire, and dragged them to safety behind a concrete barrier. The mother had been crying, clutching her children, speaking rapid Arabic that Sarah couldn't understand but didn't need to. Fear was a universal language. When she'd turned back for Miguel, there was nothing left but smoke and debris. and the terrible silence that follows violence. She'd found him 20 feet from where the bomber had detonated, his body shielding 2 other civilians who'd survived because of his sacrifice. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, and for a moment Sarah had thought he was just stunned. Then she'd seen the blood, seen the way his chest wasn't moving, and she'd known. She'd held his hand as the medics worked frantically around them, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll tell Maria you love her. I'll make sure the girls know what kind of man their father was. I'll make sure your sacrifice means something." But even as she'd said the words, she'd felt the weight of them, the impossible burden of living up to a dead hero's legacy. The medal had been presented to her 6 months later, in a ceremony she barely remembered. She'd stood at attention while some colonel read the citation, talking about her conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. The words had felt hollow, meaningless. All she could think about was Miguel's wife, Maria, sitting in the front row with their 2 daughters, trying not to cry as they gave Sarah a piece of bronze for being alive when her husband wasn't. The citation had read, "For heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Sergeant Martinez distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous actions while serving as a team leader during combat operations in Fallujah, Iraq. When insurgents attacked a crowded marketplace with suicide bombers, Sergeant Martinez, with complete disregard for her own safety, exposed herself to enemy fire to rescue 3 Iraqi civilians trapped in the kill zone. Her quick thinking and selfless courage under fire saved innocent lives and reflected great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army." But the citation didn't mention Miguel. It didn't talk about how he died, making sure she could complete the rescue. It didn't capture the weight of survivor's guilt that had settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. It didn't explain how she'd traded places with him in her dreams every night since, how she'd wake up wishing it had been her body in that crater instead of his. Sarah had never felt like she deserved it. Miguel was the hero. Miguel was the one who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. She was just the one who'd been lucky enough to survive, fast enough to reach cover, positioned in the right place to pull those civilians to safety. The medal had felt like a weight around her neck, a constant reminder of her failure to save the man who'd saved her more times than she could count. Miguel had been more than just her squad leader. He'd been her mentor, her friend, the steady presence that had kept their unit together through 18 months of hell. He'd been the one who'd talked her through her first firefight, who'd shared pictures of his daughters and made everyone remember what they were fighting for. He'd been the one who'd written letters to her parents when she'd been too overwhelmed to do it herself, who'd made sure she ate when the stress killed her appetite, who'd covered for her when the nightmares made her too exhausted to function. In the months before his death, Miguel had been talking about his plans for after the deployment. He wanted to go back to school, maybe become a teacher. He'd shown Sarah pictures of the house he and Maria were saving up to buy, a little place with a backyard where his daughters could play safely. He'd talked about coaching their soccer teams, about being the kind of father who was present for every game, every recital, every milestone. All of that had died with him in that marketplace. His daughters had grown up without their father's guidance, without his steady presence at their soccer games and school plays. Maria had raised them alone, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, carrying the double burden of grief and financial stress. And Sarah had carried the medal that should have been his, the recognition that felt like theft every time she looked at it. Now, holding it again after all these years, Sarah felt that familiar crushing weight settling back onto her shoulders. But underneath the guilt and the pain, there was something else, a burning need to know how it had ended up in that thrift store. Someone had taken it from her apartment that night, or found it somewhere she'd lost it. Someone had decided it was worth $50 and nothing more. The thought made her angry in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not the explosive rage that had consumed her that night 8 years ago, but a cold, focused fury at the idea that Miguel's sacrifice had been reduced to a price tag in a thrift store. Whoever had sold this medal clearly didn't understand what it represented, didn't know the blood that had been spilled to earn it. Sarah pulled out her phone and called the thrift store. The same bored teenager answered, his voice carrying that particular brand of customer service irritation that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Yeah, this is Sarah Martinez. I just bought the bronze star from your display case. I need to know who brought it in. Lady, we don't give out that kind of information. Privacy policy and all that. Please, this is important. That medal, it belonged to someone I knew. Someone who died. Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for the weakness. She'd spent years learning to control her emotions, to present a strong front to the world, but something about this situation was stripping away all her carefully constructed defenses. There was a pause, and she could hear the teenager talking to someone in the background. She caught fragments of the conversation. Some lady about the medal. Says someone died. Sounds pretty upset. Finally, he came back on the line. Look, I'm not supposed to do this, but hold on. She heard him talking to someone else. Then he came back. My manager says if you come back tomorrow morning, she might be able to help you. She's the one who handles the estate sales and donations. Name's Mrs. Patterson. She gets in around 9. Sarah thanked him and hung up, then sat in her car as the rain continued to fall. The parking lot was emptying out as the afternoon wore on, people hurrying through the rain with their bags of second-hand treasures. She watched them through her windshield, wondering about their stories, about what had brought them to this place of other people's discarded possessions. She thought about calling Dr. Chen, her therapist, to tell her about finding the medal. But what would she say? That she'd stumbled across a piece of her past in a thrift store, that all the progress she'd made in therapy felt suddenly fragile and uncertain. That seeing the medal had brought back all the old feelings of guilt and unworthiness she'd worked so hard to overcome. Instead, she drove home to her small apartment, the medal clutched in her hand like a talisman. The apartment was neat and sparse, decorated in the kind of neutral colors that suggested someone who didn't want to commit to anything permanent. She'd moved here 3 years ago, after finally getting stable enough to hold down a job and maintain a lease. It was better than the string of temporary housing she'd cycled through in the years immediately after her discharge. Friends' couches, extended stay motels, a brief stint in a veterans' shelter when things had gotten really bad. Sarah spent the rest of the day and most of the night staring at the medal, turning it over in her hands, trying to piece together the mystery. She skipped her therapy appointment, ignored 3 calls from her sister, and sat in her small apartment as the hours crawled by. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Miguel's face, heard his voice, felt the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. She found herself thinking about the last conversation she'd had with Miguel, just hours before the attack that killed him. They'd been sitting in the shade of their Humvee, sharing an MRE and talking about home. Miguel had shown her a new picture of his daughters, Isabella and Sophia, taken at a school dance. Isabella had been wearing a blue dress that made her look older than her 8 years, and Sophia had been grinning gap-toothed at the camera, missing her 2 front teeth. "They're growing up so fast," Miguel had said, his voice carrying that mixture of pride and melancholy that all deployed parents seem to share. "Sometimes I feel like I'm missing everything important. First steps, first words, first days of school. Maria sends me videos, but it's not the same as being there." Sarah had tried to reassure him, told him that his daughters would understand when they were older, that his sacrifice was making the world safer for them. But Miguel had shaken his head, his expression troubled. "You know what scares me most, he'd said. "It's not dying, it's the thought that they might forget me. That they'll grow up and I'll just be this vague memory, this guy in uniform in some old photographs. I want them to know who I really was, not just that I was a soldier who died in Iraq." Sarah had promised him that would never happen, that she'd make sure his daughters knew what kind of man their father had been. It was a promise she'd failed to keep, she realized now. In the 8 years since his death, she'd had no contact with Maria or the girls. She'd been too consumed with her own guilt and trauma to reach out, too afraid of seeing her own failure reflected in their eyes. The next morning, Sarah was waiting outside the thrift store when Mrs. Patterson arrived to open up. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing other people's donated possessions, sorting through the detritus of lives lived and lost. She listened patiently as Sarah explained about the medal, about losing it, about needing to know how it had ended up in the store. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more concerned as Sarah spoke. and she could see the older woman putting together pieces of a story that was clearly more complicated than a simple lost item. "I remember that piece," Mrs. Patterson said, unlocking the front door and gesturing for Sarah to follow her inside. "It came in about 3 weeks ago, part of an estate sale from a family on the east side. The woman who brought it in, she was crying, said it belonged to her father, but they needed the money for medical bills." Sarah's heart sank. The idea that someone had been forced to sell a military medal to pay for medical care made her sick. She thought about all the politicians who talked about supporting the troops, while veterans struggled with inadequate health care and financial hardship. She thought about Miguel, who died believing his sacrifice would make a difference, and wondered what he'd think about his medal being sold to pay medical bills. "Do you remember her name?" "Rodriguez. Maria Rodriguez." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, her vision blurring at the edges. Maria Rodriguez, Miguel's wife. The woman who'd sat in the front row at that medal ceremony 8 years ago, trying to hold herself together while they honored the woman who'd survived when her husband hadn't. Did she say anything else? About her father? Mrs. Patterson studied Sarah's face, seeing something there that made her expression soften with understanding. She said he'd been a soldier, that he'd died in Iraq. She had his Purple Heart too, but she couldn't bring herself to sell that one, just the Bronze Star. She paused, her voice growing gentler. "You knew him, didn't you?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Miguel's daughter, little Isabella, who'd been only 8 years old when her father died, who'd worn that blue dress to the school dance in the picture Miguel had shown her. She'd be 16 now, old enough to understand the weight of financial desperation, old enough to make the heartbreaking decision to sell her father's medal to pay for something more immediate and necessary. But wait. Mrs. Patterson had said the medal belonged to Maria's father, not her husband. That didn't make sense. Unless... "Mrs. Patterson, are you sure she said it was her father's medal, not her husband's?" The older woman frowned, thinking, "You know, now that you mention it, I might have misunderstood. She was very upset, crying quite a bit. She might have said husband. Or maybe she was talking about someone else's father." She shook her head. "I'm sorry, dear. When people are that emotional, sometimes the details get fuzzy." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If Maria had been selling the medal, how had she gotten it in the first place? Sarah had lost it during her breakdown 8 years ago, but she'd never had any contact with Miguel's family since his death. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together the way she'd expected. "Do you have her contact information?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "I'm not supposed to. Please, I need to return this to her. It should never have been sold." Something in Sarah's voice must have convinced her, because Mrs. Patterson disappeared into the back office and returned with a piece of paper. "This is the address she gave us. But honey, if you're going to contact her, be gentle. That girl was carrying a lot of pain." Sarah took the address with trembling hands. The paper felt fragile, like it might disintegrate if she held it too tightly. She thanked Mrs. Patterson and walked back to her car, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. How had Maria gotten the medal? Why was she selling it now? And what medical bills was she trying to pay? Sarah drove across town to the address, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The neighborhood was one she recognized, working class, mostly Hispanic families, the kind of place where people worked 2 jobs and still struggled to make ends meet. The houses were small but well maintained, with carefully tended gardens and children's toys scattered in front yards. American flags hung from several porches, and she could see the yellow ribbon magnets on many of the cars parked along the street. She found the house, a small adobe structure with a carefully maintained front yard and a faded yellow ribbon tied to the mailbox. The ribbon was weathered and sun-bleached, suggesting it had been there for years. A small garden bloomed in the front yard, with roses and marigolds planted in neat rows. Someone had put a lot of care into this place, despite what were obviously limited resources. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. What would she say? How do you explain to a dead man's daughter that you've been carrying her father's medal around like a burden for 8 years? That you've spent every day since his death wishing it had been you instead? How do you apologize for 8 years of silence, for failing to keep the promise you'd made to a dying man? She thought about Miguel's last words to her, whispered as the medics worked frantically around them. "Take care of them for me, Martinez. Make sure they know I loved them." She'd nodded, promised she would, but then she'd disappeared into her own trauma and left his family to grieve alone. Finally, Sarah forced herself out of the car and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. She could hear voices inside, the sound of a television, normal family life continuing in the shadow of loss. A dog barked somewhere in the backyard, and she could smell something cooking. Beans and spices that reminded her of the meals Miguel used to talk about, the food he missed from home. She knocked softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Footsteps approached the door, and she heard the sound of locks being undone. The door opened to reveal a young woman with Miguel's eyes and her mother's gentle smile. Isabella Rodriguez had grown into a beautiful teenager, but Sarah could see the weight she carried in the set of her shoulders, the premature seriousness in her expression. Isabella was taller than Sarah had expected, with long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and paint stains on her fingers that suggested she'd been working on some kind of art project. She wore a faded t-shirt from a local high school and jeans with carefully patched holes at the knees. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself, that reminded Sarah so strongly of Miguel that it took her breath away. "Can I help you?" Isabella asked, her voice polite but cautious. Sarah could see the teenager taking in her appearance, noting the nervous energy, the way Sarah's hands were shaking slightly. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I served with your father in Iraq." Isabella's expression changed immediately, a mixture of surprise and wariness crossing her features. Sarah could see the girl's defenses going up, the way she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. It was a gesture Sarah recognized from Miguel, the way he'd prepared himself for difficult news or challenging situations. "Mom!" Isabella called over her shoulder, never taking her eyes off Sarah. "There's someone here about Dad." Maria Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, older now, her hair streaked with grey, but still recognizably the woman who'd sat in the front row at that medal ceremony 8 years ago. She'd aged more than the years would account for, with lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. But her eyes were still kind, still carrying that warmth that Miguel had always talked about. Her eyes widened when she saw Sarah, and for a moment neither woman spoke. Sarah could see recognition dawning in Maria's face, followed quickly by confusion and something that might have been fear. "Sergeant Martinez, is that really you?" "Just Sarah now, ma'am. I need to talk to you about something. About your husband." Maria's hand went to her throat, a gesture of unconscious protection. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" "No, ma'am. Nothing new. It's about something from a long time ago. Something I need to return to you." Maria invited her in, and Sarah found herself sitting in a living room that was clearly a shrine to Miguel's memory. His photos covered the mantelpiece, his Purple Heart displayed in a place of honor, his dress uniform hanging in a frame on the wall. But Sarah noticed what was missing, the bronze star that should have been displayed alongside the Purple Heart. The room was small but comfortable, with a couch that had seen better days and a coffee table covered with homework and art supplies. Children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator in the adjoining kitchen, and Sarah could see family photos covering every available surface. It was a home filled with love, despite the obvious financial constraints. Isabella sat on the arm of her mother's chair, one hand resting protectively on her mother's shoulder. The gesture reminded Sarah of the way Miguel used to position himself between his squad and potential threats, always ready to shield the people he cared about. "I know why you're here," Maria said quietly, settling into a chair across from Sarah. Her voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the arms of her chair. "You found out about the medal." Sarah pulled the bronze star from her pocket, still wrapped in the tissue paper from the thrift store. The paper had gotten slightly crumpled during the drive, and she smoothed it carefully before setting it on the coffee table between them. "This is mine," she said. "I mean, it was awarded to me for the day your husband died." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and Isabella's grip on her mother's shoulder tightened. "I don't understand," Maria whispered. "I lost it years ago, during a bad night. PTSD episode. I thought I'd thrown it away, but somehow it ended up in your possession. I need to know how." Isabella and Maria exchanged a look, and Sarah saw a story passing between them, something heavy and complicated. There were secrets here, Sarah realized, family history that she wasn't privy to. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and shared memories. "Tell her, mija," Maria said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabella took a deep breath, and Sarah could see her gathering her courage. After Dad died, Mom went through a really dark period. She was drinking, not taking care of herself. I was just a kid, but I could see she was drowning. One night, about 8 years ago, she got a call from someone at the VA. A woman who was having a breakdown, threatening to hurt herself. Mom went to help. Sarah's blood ran cold. She remembered that night, remembered the darkness that had consumed her, the way she'd called the crisis line in desperation. But she didn't remember anyone coming to help. The memories of that night were fragmented, broken pieces of rage and despair that she'd never been able to put back together completely. "The woman was you," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger as she told the story. "Mom found you in your apartment, surrounded by broken things. You were unconscious, and there was blood. Mom called an ambulance, but while she was waiting, she saw the medal on the floor. She picked it up to keep it safe, but in all the chaos of getting you to the hospital, she forgot about it." The room seemed to spin around Sarah as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Maria had been there that night. Maria had been the one who'd saved her life, who'd called the ambulance, who'd kept her from bleeding out on her apartment floor, and in the process, she'd inadvertently taken the medal that Sarah had thought she'd destroyed in her rage. Maria was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to find you afterward to return it, but the hospital wouldn't give me any information, and I didn't know your first name. I just knew you were the woman who'd saved those people the day Miguel died. I kept the medal, thinking someday I'd figure out how to get it back to you." Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. The irony was overwhelming. Miguel's wife had saved her life, had been the anonymous Good Samaritan who'd prevented her from becoming another veteran suicide statistic. And she'd been carrying Sarah's medal all these years, not knowing how to return it to its rightful owner. "But why sell it now?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand. The medical bills Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, the careful way Isabella and Maria were dressed, the patches on Isabella's jeans, all signs of a family struggling financially. Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom has cancer, stage 3, the treatments. Our insurance doesn't cover everything. We've been selling things, trying to keep up with the medical bills. Mom didn't want to sell Dad's Purple Heart, but she thought maybe the Bronze Star could help save her life, the way you saved those people in Iraq." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Maria's quiet crying and the distant hum of traffic outside. Sarah stared at the medal on the coffee table, understanding finally flooding through her like a revelation. This wasn't about her guilt or her unworthiness. This wasn't about Miguel's sacrifice or her survival. This was about the ripple effects of heroism, the way one act of courage could echo through the years in ways you never imagined. Miguel had died saving civilians and covering Sarah's retreat. Sarah had survived to save more people, including the family she'd rescued that day. Maria had saved Sarah's life 8 years later, keeping the cycle of heroism going. And now Sarah had the chance to save Maria, to complete a circle that had started in a dusty marketplace in Iraq and led to this small living room in Phoenix. "Maria," Sarah said, her voice steady for the first time in years, "Miguel didn't just save those civilians that day. He saved me. And you saved me again that night 8 years ago. And now, maybe I can save you." She stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, placing the Bronze Star next to Miguel's Purple Heart where it belonged. The two medals looked right together, she thought, like they'd been waiting 8 years to be reunited. The Bronze Star caught the light from the window, its bronze surface gleaming next to the purple and gold of Miguel's Purple Heart. "This medal doesn't belong to me, it never did. It belongs to your family, to Miguel's memory, but more than that." She turned back to face them, her decision crystallizing with each word. "I want to help with your medical bills. I've been saving money for years, not knowing what to do with it. I think I know now." "We can't accept that," Maria protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah could see the hope warring with pride in her expression. the desperate need for help battling against a lifetime of self-reliance. Yes, you can, because this is what Miguel would have wanted. He spent his whole career taking care of his soldiers, taking care of people who needed help. Let me honor his memory by taking care of his family. Sarah pulled out her phone and called her bank, arranging for a transfer that would cover Maria's treatment costs and more. She'd been living frugally for years, saving money without any real purpose, just accumulating it like a security blanket against an uncertain future. Now she finally understood what that money was for. As she spoke to the financial advisor, she watched Isabella and Maria hold each other, hope replacing despair in their eyes for the first time in months. Isabella was crying now too, but these were tears of relief rather than grief. Sarah could see some of the weight lifting from the teenager's shoulders, the burden of trying to be strong for her sick mother finally easing. When she hung up, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. She understood now that survival wasn't something to feel guilty about. It was something to use, a tool for continuing the work that Miguel had started. "There's something else," Sarah said, settling back into her chair. "I've been going to therapy, working through my PTSD. It's helped, but I've been thinking about doing more. Maybe starting a support group for veterans or volunteering with families who've lost someone in combat. Would you be willing to help me with that? I think Miguel would like knowing that his sacrifice led to something bigger than just one saved life." Maria wiped her eyes and smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her. It transformed her face, erasing years of worry and grief, and Sarah could see the woman Miguel had fallen in love with all those years ago. He would love that. He always said the best way to honor the dead was to keep living, keep helping people. He used to talk about starting a program for veterans when he got home, something to help with the transition back to civilian life. Isabella looked up from her mother's shoulder, her eyes bright with tears and possibility. "I could help too. I'm good with computers, social media stuff. I could help you reach people who need support." As they talked, Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Miguel's death, she felt connected to something larger than her own pain. She felt like she was part of a family again, part of a mission that mattered. As Sarah prepared to leave, Isabella walked her to the door. The teenager moved with a grace that reminded Sarah of her father, but there was something uniquely her own in the way she carried herself, a strength that had been forged through years of helping her mother cope with loss and illness. "Sergeant Martinez." "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you really think my dad was a hero?" Sarah looked back at the living room, at the photos of Miguel in his uniform, at Maria sitting beside his medals, with hope in her eyes, for the first time in months. She thought about the man who'd made her laugh during the darkest days of deployment, who'd shared pictures of his daughters and made everyone remember what they were fighting for, who'd died making sure she could save innocent lives. "Your father was the best man I ever knew. He taught me that heroism isn't about the medals you earn or the recognition you get. It's about the choice to keep serving, even when no one's watching, even when it costs you everything." Isabella nodded, understanding passing between them. "Will you come back? To visit, I mean. Mom doesn't have many people who knew Dad the way you did. I'd like that very much." Sarah drove home through the Phoenix streets as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in 8 years, she wasn't running from her memories. She was carrying them forward, using them as fuel for something better. The city looked different somehow, more vibrant and alive. She noticed things she'd been blind to for years. Children playing in front yards, families walking together. The simple beauty of people living their lives without the weight of trauma pressing down on them. She felt like she was seeing the world through new eyes, eyes that weren't clouded by guilt and self-recrimination. That night she called Dr. Chen and told her about the medal, about the Rodriguez family, about the decision she'd made to start helping other veterans and military families. Her therapist listened quietly, asking occasional questions, helping Sarah process the emotional whirlwind of the day. "You know, Sarah, I think you've finally understood the difference between surviving and living. Surviving is what you did for 8 years. Existing, getting by, carrying your guilt like a weight. Living is what you're doing now, using your experience to lift others up, The words resonated with Sarah long after she hung up the phone. She sat in her apartment, looking around at the neutral walls and sparse furnishings, and realized that this place had never been a home. It had been a hiding place, a bunker where she could retreat from the world and nurse her wounds. But she didn't need to hide anymore. Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself into planning the support group with an energy she hadn't felt in years. She researched best practices for veteran support programs, reached out to other organizations for advice, and worked with Isabella to create a social media presence that could reach veterans and military families who needed help. Maria, despite her ongoing cancer treatments, became an invaluable partner in the effort. Her experience as a military widow gave her insights into the challenges faced by families who'd lost someone in service, and her natural empathy made her a gifted counselor for people struggling with grief and loss. 3 months later, Sarah stood in a community center conference room, looking at a circle of folding chairs filled with veterans and military family members. The support group had grown from just her and Maria to 15 regular attendees, people who came together every week to share their stories, their struggles, and their hope. The group was diverse, veterans from different conflicts, family members dealing with various stages of grief, active duty personnel struggling with deployment stress. There was James, a Vietnam veteran who'd never talked about his experiences until he walked into their meeting. There was Linda, whose son had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan and who'd been drowning in grief until she found their group. There was Marcus, a young Marine dealing with PTSD from his deployment to Syria, who'd been on the verge of suicide when Isabella had reached out to him through social media. Miguel's bronze star sat on a small table at the front of the room, not as Sarah's burden, but as a symbol of the continuing mission. Next to it was a photo of Miguel in his dress uniform, smiling that easy grin that had gotten them all through the darkest days in Iraq. But the table also held photos of other fallen service members, brought by family members who wanted to honor their loved ones' memories. "Before we start tonight," Sarah said to the group, "I want to tell you about a man named Miguel Rodriguez, and about the day I learned that heroism isn't something you achieve once and then carry around like a medal. It's something you choose again and again every day you decide to keep serving others." As she began to tell Miguel's story, Sarah felt his presence in the room, not as a ghost or a burden, but as a guide. She understood now that he hadn't died so she could feel guilty for the rest of her life. He died so she could live, really live, and use that life to continue the work of healing and helping that he'd started. The medal on the table caught the light from the fluorescent bulbs overhead, its bronze surface gleaming like a promise. Not a promise of glory or recognition, but a promise that sacrifice has meaning, that heroism ripples outward through time, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight long after the war is over. In the end, Sarah realized, the medal had never been lost at all. It had just been waiting for her to understand what it really meant, and to find the courage to live up to the example of the man who died earning it. Miguel Rodriguez had saved her life twice, once in Iraq and once in a thrift store in Phoenix, where a piece of bronze and ribbon had taught her the difference between surviving and truly living. The group session continued late into the evening, stories shared and burdens lifted, healing happening one conversation at a time. And in that circle of folding chairs, surrounded by people who understood the weight of service and sacrifice, Sarah finally felt like she'd come home from the war. As the meeting wound down and people began to leave, Maria approached Sarah with a small wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this," she said, pressing it into Sarah's hands. "Miguel would have wanted you to have it." Sarah unwrapped the package to find Miguel's dog tags, the metal worn smooth from years of wear. "I can't take these," she protested, but Maria shook her head. "You're family now," Maria said simply, "and family takes care of each other." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she slipped the dog tags over her head. They felt different from the medal, not like a burden or a symbol of unworthiness, but like a connection to something larger than herself. Like a reminder that she was part of a brotherhood that transcended death, part of a mission that would continue as long as there were people willing to serve others. As she locked up the community center that night, Sarah looked back at the empty circle of chairs and smiled. Tomorrow there would be new people, new stories, new opportunities to help and heal. The work would continue, just as Miguel would have wanted. The Bronze Star was going home with Maria and Isabella, where it belonged. But its real purpose had been fulfilled, not as a symbol of individual heroism, but as a catalyst for something much larger. A reminder that the best way to honor the dead is to keep living, keep serving, keep choosing heroism one day at a time.